I'm going to talk about pots and the beauty of using pots, particularly in small gardens or in courtyards or on balconies. Pots are a wonderful way to create plants with a bit of colour and movement that we can have near a window or in a closed courtyard, which actually brings the garden inside, particularly, obviously being able to see it from a window or somewhere that you walk by often. When creating pots, there's a few things that we just have to think about. The first is buying the pot. What I've got here is a terracotta pot. It's a nice simple form. It's just big enough to do a few things. You don't want your pots too small because with using plants for different reasons, it's just nice to have a bit of room. If we're going to use a terracotta pot, the other thing is to get one that's sealed. If the terracotta pot is too open, and a lot of the old ones were still very porous, it actually draws water out far too quickly. A lot of the new terracotta pots are sealed with a product which is much better for retaining water. The other really important thing when putting a pot together is the type of potting media we use. And I always recommend that you buy a good potting mix from your local hardware. The more expensive ones are more expensive for a good reason. They often come with a slow release fertiliser and enough organic matter to actually hold the moisture in. What we don't want is a pot that just drains completely so that you have to keep watering it. All pots need water, and they'll need water depending on what plants you put in there. Maybe sometimes once a day if we're growing tomatoes in there, or if we're growing some ornamental plants, they would need a good water once a week. What I'm going to talk about today is an ornamental pot, not a vegetable or a herb garden pot, but an ornamental pot. When we put pots together, they are artificial just in their construct, so they're not going to last forever. So you put a pot together that might last, if you get 4 to 5 years out of a pot, that's fabulous. More often you'll get 2, maybe 3 years out of the pot. Plants grow, they fill up that root mass, and they'll need to be repotted after that time. But I'm going to put one together today that I reckon you would get 2 to 3 years out of. The first thing we do is the plants that we're going to put together must all like the same environment. This pot is designed to sit on a balcony in full sun. So the plants I'm going to put together must really enjoy the hard climates. And I've selected 2 plants to put here. One is just good old common thyme. It's the little variegated thyme, but it's quite prostrate in its form, but it's got a lovely free feel to it. It's quite soft. And I'm going to put that together with a plant which is an old world plant, which is just common old jade. Very easy to grow. Both these plants are incredibly tough. This is my main player. This is the big boy. So he's the one that's going to be my main feature. These guys are just going to support him. But by bringing them together, I'm working with the sort of contrast in the texture. This is a succulent and it's got that glaucous, beautiful, shiny foliage, whereas this is much softer. But you bring them together and there's a really nice relationship. It's simple, and in this situation, I'm only using the 2 types of plants. So let's take this out of its pot. We've got to be very careful with things like jade because while they're very tough, they can actually snap and break. And if they do snap and break, a little piece like that, you can just put that in and it'll grow its own roots really easily. So that's the one thing about them. But you do have to be careful when you handle them. The other thing when I'm potting up and using potting mix, must always wear gloves. And it takes a little bit of the feel away for you. But with potting mix, you just got to be a little bit careful when handling it and breathing it in. So it's good to keep it moist and always wear gloves. Now with my jade, this is in pretty good nick. It's not too root bound. I'm just giving it a slight tickle. I've filled my pot up with my potting mix, and I've just going to make sure that that's to the right level so that when I put this plant in, it just comes to within about 25 mil of the top of the pot. So what I'm talking about is this level to that level. And by having a little bit of freeboard, it just holds the water. So it acts like a reservoir, which is what we want to do. Now, before I put the soil in, I'm just positioning that, and I'm positioning it right in the centre. Then with my thymes, which again, I just pull out, they're in quite good nick. They don't need much root teasing. And I'm just going to set them up a little bit here. I'll bring in a little bit more potting mix just to start to fill around this. So we'll just pull all these out, slight tease. Press them in. A little bit of a tickle. press them in. When there's nothing better really than putting a pot out that's got a little bit of maturity for some instant effect. Beauty of using time is, and having it near the kitchen is, if you do need that little bit of time for the cooking, there you go. Now just with the potting soil, and just doing this fairly delicately, I'm going to just get this in all around the zone of the plant. What we try to do is not have any air spaces in the pot, and we just filter that in with our hands. Give it a bit of a shake around. Just make sure everything is firmed in. Just finishing up a little bit of plant detailing just to trim any of the little dead bits off. I've kind of finished my arrangement. I've pressed in as much potting mix as possible, so the last thing to do is just to water it in. And the beauty of watering it in is it actually allows the soil to settle and remove any of the air that might have come about by you just placing the soil in by hand. So it's good to water it really well, let it sink in, and then perhaps come back in another 15 or 20 minutes and water it in again. I actually think it's very simple, but we've got this lovely textural contrast between the succulent foliage and the thyme. The thyme is going to soften around the pot, so it'll weep over the pot and just soften that. The jade is a very slow growing plant. It will become quite root bound, but it won't suffer that much, and it'll just kind of ball up a little bit. And we would just have to water this once a week. Both these plants are very tough, very, very tough. So just watering that once a week, sitting out in the full sun, it'll absolutely look fantastic for 2 to 3 years. You just may need to feed it. I mean, pots drain water, so if you fertilise it, you drain that out. So, you know, probably every 6 weeks between September to November, and then again leave it a little bit in the really hot period, but probably from March through to April, May, you would just feed it with a general fertiliser once every probably 4 to 6 weeks. And I reckon that's not a bad pot to sit out on your balcony.